Less than 2 years ago, Google stood on a stage in Stockholm and accepted a Nobel Prize for what was, without much argument, the single greatest scientific achievement to ever come out of an AI lab. The system was called AlphaFold. It solved a 50-year-old problem in biology that thousands of human scientists had failed to crack, and it did it in minutes instead of decades. Google put it on every keynote, every recruiting page, every investor call. It was the proof that AI could do something no one could dismiss as a party trick. And now, quietly, without a keynote, without a press conference, the team that built it has been taken apart, not shut down in a headline. Dismantled in the background, one reassignment at a time, while the company's public messaging never once used the word ending. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why the people who built the most celebrated AI system in history are now scattered or gone entirely, and what Google is actually saying behind closed doors that is very different from what it is saying in public. Quick word before we start. I track AI lab restructurings and talent movement specifically. The org charts nobody publishes, the quiet reassignments, the departures that get buried under a generic pursuing new opportunities line. That is the lens for this video. I will be precise about what has been independently reported and confirmed by the company itself, and where I am reading between the lines, I will tell you clearly. Let's get into it. To understand how big a deal this is, you need to understand what problem AlphaFold actually solved, because it is not comparable to a chatbot getting slightly better at answering questions. Proteins are the molecular machines that do almost everything inside a living cell, and what a protein does is determined almost entirely by its three-dimensional shape, how the long chain of amino acids that makes it up folds itself into a specific structure. For 50 years, figuring out that shape from the amino acid sequence alone was one of biology's hardest unsolved problems, sometimes requiring years of painstaking lab work using techniques like X-ray crystallography just to map a single protein. DeepMind started building AlphaFold in 2018 specifically to attack that problem with deep learning instead of a lab bench. By 2021, the team had published results in Nature that essentially solved it, predicting the structures of the entire human proteome, every protein the human body makes, and then giving the results away for free through a public database that now holds over 200 million predicted structures. That work is not academic trivia. It is actively used right now to accelerate drug discovery, develop vaccines, and understand the structural changes in proteins linked to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In 2024, DeepMind's chief executive Demis Hassabis and the scientist who led the technical work, John Jumper, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for it. This was not a promising research direction. This was one of the most concretely, verifiably successful applications of AI that has ever existed, validated by the single most prestigious scientific body on the planet. It is worth sitting with just how unusual that Nobel Prize actually was, because it changes how strange the story becomes. The Nobel Committee does not hand out chemistry prizes for software. In the entire history of the award, recognizing an AI system's output as a genuine scientific breakthrough on the level of, say, discovering the structure of DNA was essentially unprecedented. It signaled that the scientific establishment itself, not tech journalists, not investors, not Google's own marketing department, had independently concluded that AlphaFold represented a categorically different kind of achievement than a chatbot getting better benchmark scores. That is the bar this specific team cleared. Not impressive for an AI system. Genuinely, independently, historically significant, full stop, measured by the same standard applied to human researchers who spent entire careers on comparable problems. Which is exactly what makes the next part of this story so strange. According to a Financial Times investigation published on July 29th and independently confirmed by DeepMind itself in statements to multiple outlets afterward, the dedicated team responsible for AlphaFold has been effectively broken apart. Not fired en masse, not shut down with an announcement. Reassigned gradually over roughly the past year, until the team that built the Nobel-winning system essentially no longer exists in its original form. Here is where the researchers actually went. Some were moved internally onto Gemini-focused projects, Google's large language model effort, the same product line racing against OpenAI and Anthropic for consumer and enterprise AI dominance. Others were shifted onto different scientific problems entirely. Enzyme design, nuclear fusion research, genomics. A portion were reassigned to Isomorphic Labs, the Alphabet-owned drug discovery company that was originally spun out of DeepMind, specifically because of AlphaFold's success, and which now holds pharmaceutical partnerships with companies including Novartis and Eli Lilly. On paper, none of that sounds like a shutdown. It sounds like redistribution. But then there is the part of this story that is much harder to spin as routine reorganization. Nearly a quarter of the full-time DeepMind authors who wrote the original AlphaFold research papers have left the company entirely, not moved to a different Google team, gone. And the most damaging exit of all, John Jumper, the Nobel laureate himself, who joined the project as a staff research scientist back in 2018 and rose to vice president and engineering fellow, announced in June that he was leaving DeepMind for Anthropic. He did not leave alone. Two other core AlphaFold researchers, Jonas Adler and Alexander Pritzel, followed him out the door to the same competitor within weeks. One DeepMind employee, speaking to the Financial Times, described the three departing researchers as instrumental and core members of the team, and said their exits sparked real surprise internally, meaning even people inside DeepMind were not fully prepared for how this played out. Read that carefully. This is not outside speculation about internal shock. That characterization came from someone inside the company itself, at the time these departures were happening. It is worth being precise here about what has and has not actually been confirmed, because the more sensational headlines circulating since the Financial Times report have occasionally overstated the claim AlphaFold as a piece of technology has not been shut down. The AlphaFold protein structure database, which holds more than 200 million predicted structures, remains fully online and free to access. The AlphaFold server and AlphaFold 3 are both still operational for academic use, and the science built on top of them continues to be cited and used across the drug discovery world. What has ended is the dedicated standalone team structure that built it, the specific organizational unit staffed by the specific people who wrote the original research that made AlphaFold possible in the first place. That distinction matters, and it is also, in a strange way, what makes this story more troubling rather than less. Google is not claiming AlphaFold failed. It is not walking away from underperforming technology. It dismantled a team that was, by every available measure, one of the most successful research efforts in the company's history. And it did so quietly enough that most of the public did not find out until an outside newspaper's investigation forced the confirmation. So what does Google actually say happened here? DeepMind's own research vice president, Pushmeet Kohli, gave the closest thing to an official explanation when he told the Financial Times that the lab's approach for roughly the last 9 years had been built around picking specific grand challenges and assembling dedicated teams to solve them one at a time, and that this strategy has now evolved. DeepMind's public statement following the reporting struck a similarly measured tone, expressing pride in AlphaFold's scientific legacy, and noting that many of the researchers behind it continue to drive scientific and technological progress across Google, DeepMind, and isomorphic labs. Notice what that explanation does and does not say. It confirms the team structure changed. It does not explain why 3 of the most senior, most publicly celebrated scientists on that team chose to leave the company entirely rather than simply move to whatever comes next inside Google. A strategic reorganization explains reassignment. It does not, on its own, explain a Nobel laureate walking out the door to a direct competitor within the same year his prize-winning project got quietly broken up. Here is the more direct read that several outlets covering this story converged on, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the part Google's own language is carefully built to avoid saying out loud. DeepMind is moving away from the exact model that made it the most respected AI research lab in the world, small, focused teams solving deep, specific scientific problems, and consolidating almost everything around Gemini. The general-purpose large language model competing directly against ChatGPT and Claude for market share, revenue, and enterprise contracts. That is not a subtle shift in emphasis. That is a fundamental change in what kind of company DeepMind is trying to be. One version of DeepMind wins Nobel Prizes for solving problems that mattered for 50 years. The other version of DeepMind ships quarterly model updates and fights for leaderboard position against 3 or 4 other companies doing the exact same thing. And the timing here is not incidental. Google's most recent flagship release, Gemini Flash 3.6, landed in independent third-party benchmarking behind every other frontier AI lab it was compared against. A genuinely rough result for the company that originated the transformer architecture the entire modern AI industry is built on. When a company is trailing the field on the metric it has decided matters most, and simultaneously breaks up its most decorated, most scientifically legitimate research team to redirect that talent toward the exact race it is losing, the connection between those two facts does not require much speculation to draw. Before I get into why the researchers who left specifically chose Anthropic and what that says about the state of the AI talent war right now, I need to ask one thing. If this breakdown is giving you the layered, sourced version of what's actually happening inside these labs that you are not getting from a headline that just says, Google restructures AI team, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. These reorganizations happen quietly and get buried fast. I track the follow-up, who left, where they went, what it means, long after everyone else has moved on to the next story. Stay subscribed, so you're not finding out about the next one 3 months late. The fact that Jumper, Adler, and Pritzel specifically chose Anthropic is not a random data point. Anthropic had, shortly before these departures, launched a dedicated science-focused effort aimed at biology and drug discovery applications, meaning the researchers who built AlphaFold did not leave the field they had spent their careers in. They left the company for a direct competitor building a comparable scientific research capability at almost the exact moment their original employer was dismantling the team structure that let them do that work in the first place. That detail matters enormously for how you should read this story. If these researchers had left AI research entirely, or taken academic positions, you could reasonably chalk it up to individual career decisions unrelated to Google's internal strategy. Instead, they took their specific expertise, built over years on Google's own project, directly to a rival lab that is now positioned to compete in the exact scientific niche that used to be DeepMind's most defensible advantage. That is not researchers wandering off. That is a company's own reorganization actively pushing its most valuable specialized talent into a competitor's hands, at a moment when the competitive landscape for AI research talent has arguably never been tighter or more expensive. It also raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about incentive structures inside large AI labs right now. If the message a Nobel Prize winning team receives from leadership is that a 9-year strategy built around deep, focused scientific challenges has evolved into something centered on a general-purpose product race, what does that tell every other specialized research team still standing inside that same organization about how leadership is likely to value their work 5 years from now? You do not need an internal memo to guess how that question lands with people who have spent their careers optimizing for scientific rigor over shipping velocity. Zoom out, because this story is not really just about one team at one company. It is a preview of a tension that every major AI lab is going to face as the pressure to compete on general-purpose model performance intensifies. AlphaFold succeeded because it was allowed to be narrow. It was not trying to also write essays, debug code, and hold a conversation. It existed to solve exactly one extraordinarily hard problem, with a team resourced and structured specifically around that single goal for years without needing to justify its existence against a quarterly leaderboard ranking against 3 or 4 other companies shipping monthly updates. That model produced one of the most genuinely important scientific achievements of the last decade. The model DeepMind appears to be moving toward instead consolidated, Gemini-centric, oriented around a continuously shipping general-purpose product, is optimized for a completely different kind of success. It is built to compete in a market where speed, breadth, and benchmark performance against named rivals matter more than a single team spending years quietly solving one deep problem no one else has cracked. Both models can produce real value, but they are not the same model, and a company cannot fully run both at once without something eventually giving way. And in this specific case, what gave way was the team that won the company its only Nobel Prize. The honest, uncomfortable read of the AlphaFold story is that it may be less about AlphaFold specifically and more about what happens to deep scientific research inside any company once the pressure to compete in a fast-moving consumer AI product race becomes the dominant priority at the top. AlphaFold was never going to move the needle on Gemini's weekly active users or its position in a benchmark leaderboard. It moved the needle on drug discovery timelines measured in years for diseases that do not care about quarterly earnings calls. Those two kinds of value are both real. They are just very hard to weigh against each other inside the same budget meeting. And this reorganization is what it looks like when one of them loses that argument. There is also a longer-term risk buried in here that goes beyond any single company's org chart. If the lesson other AI labs draw from this story is that deep, patient, narrowly focused scientific research gets deprioritized the moment a general-purpose product race heats up, the incentive for any lab to fund the next AlphaFold scale project gets meaningfully weaker. AlphaFold took years with no guarantee of success before it produced a result worth publishing. That is exactly the kind of project that is easiest to defund when leadership is under pressure to show quarter-over-quarter progress on a leaderboard. Everyone else is also racing to top. If the AlphaFold story becomes a template rather than an exception, the actual cost is not measured in any one company's talent losses. It is measured in the scientific breakthroughs that never get funded in the first place, because no lab wants to be the one holding a narrow, unglamorous research bet, while its competitors are shipping monthly model updates and capturing the headlines that come with them. 2 things before you go. First, if this gave you a clearer, more honest picture of what's actually happening behind Google's public messaging than the initial headlines did, share it with someone who works in AI, biotech, or research funding. This exact tension between focused science and general-purpose product races is going to keep showing up, and most people are not connecting these stories to each other yet. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think Google made the right long-term call prioritizing Gemini over dedicated scientific teams like AlphaFold's, even knowing it cost them their most celebrated researchers? And where do you think the next major AI lab reorganization is going to hit? Drop it below. I read everyone, and if this was worth your time, hit like before you go. Here is where this actually stands. AlphaFold solved a 50-year-old problem in biology, won Google's DeepMind lab a Nobel Prize in 2024, and became the single clearest proof point the entire AI industry had that these systems could produce world-changing scientific value rather than just impressive demos. Starting roughly a year ago, and confirmed publicly through Financial Times reporting in late July, Google quietly dismantled the dedicated team behind it, reassigning most of the original researchers toward Gemini, enzyme design, nuclear fusion, genomics, and the Isomorphic Labs drug discovery spinout. Nearly a quarter of the team's original paper authors left the company entirely, including Nobel laureate John Jumper and 2 other core researchers, all of whom moved directly to Anthropic within weeks of each other, landing at a rival lab that had just launched its own dedicated science research effort. DeepMind's public explanation describes an evolved strategy moving away from single-focus grand challenge teams toward Gemini-centered research, but that framing conveniently avoids addressing why its most senior scientific talent chose to leave the company entirely rather than simply follow the new direction internally. The underlying story here is bigger than one research team. It is what happens when the pressure to compete in a fast, general-purpose AI product race collides with the slower, deeper kind of scientific work that made a lab's reputation in the first place. And in this case, the product race won, the scientific team lost, and Google's most decorated researchers walked out the door to help a competitor build the next version of exactly what they used to build here. Stay locked in, because this reorganization story is far from finished playing out.